Good evening and welcome to this roundtable meeting of the Cambridge City Council. Today is Monday, December 14th. I'm just going to quickly read the call of the meeting and be a roundtable working meeting to discuss transportation issues. As with all roundtable meetings, there'll be no public comment and no votes will be taken. The meeting is not televised, however, the chair is going to inform that folks are recording the meeting by both audio and visual devices. And the microphone is on. And with that, I am going to ask the city manager if he would like to open and introduce the panel that he has put together.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So we will have tonight the traffic department with Joe Barr, Iram, and Suzanne, Susan from Community Development, Owen and Kathy from Public Works, and Jack Albert representing the police. I think, as all of you know, as we do our transportation planning, it certainly involves all these departments in all aspects of this one way or another. Whether we're talking about modes of transportation, whether we're talking about recommendations for developers, or whether we're working with the schools around safety, etc. All these issues are really part and parcel of all these departments as they reevaluate the reconstruction of streets and what kind of a community we want, the planning that goes on, the implementation, and then the actual, let's call it observation or enforcement, really are all done in collaboration. I think we can, go through this and certainly be interrupted for questions that people feel necessary to have, and we can general questions at the end. But I would like to turn it over to Joe.
Sure. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about transportation in a sort of more informal format. So the agenda, which you have in front of you, is kind of 6 pieces. I won't read it, since I know you're all capable of doing that. But it's going to be
Don't be so certain.
Well, as the city manager mentioned, it'll be sort of a tag team from myself and Iram and Suzanne and Kathy and Jack, and we'll get through hopefully a lot of different topics and give you kind of a sense of where we're coming from on transportation and what we see as some of the emerging issues towards the end. But the idea is, again, to get as much information to you and then as much information back to you as possible. So look forward to hopefully an interactive discussion. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about sort of our approach to transportation, both locally and regionally, and Iram's going to talk a little bit about sort of the local level.
Thanks, Joe. So this is super brief, but I just wanted to really mention that all of the departments that you have represented here today, as well as others like the fire department, are involved in all of the transportation efforts that we undertake. And I think that's a really important component of how we deal with transportation planning and infrastructure changes. And there's obviously a lot of, as we go through the process, there are different organizations, different entities from the city that are in the lead at different stages. But it's really important to note that all of us are involved at just about every stage. So there might be instances where you might see CDD folks out doing the early stage planning, but it's not without the benefit of the thinking of how the project will get built or how it will be operated or how safety will be managed and how emergency vehicles will get through that area. And so that's really why you see, we have we don't have fire department here just because they're not here today, but they're really also a key piece of the puzzle in here. And I think that our work is actually richer as a result of that because there's a creative tension because on the one hand, we're trying to push ahead at CDD on the different modes and thinking about how to maybe advance more sustainable modes, but at the same time, we have to be thinking about how will the project be built and maintained, and that's something that DPW brings very strongly, in addition to the shared agenda of trying to encourage all the different roads in a safe way, which is something that the police is bringing to the table, and then the traffic parking department is trying to make sure that operationally everything will work. So just wanted to mention that that's a really, we try to make sure that all projects have that very holistic perspective of everything that happens in Cambridge. So I'm going to turn it back to Joe to talk about the regional issues.
So moving beyond our 6.2 square miles, we work very closely with the state agencies like the T, MassDOT, or the DCR, as well as regional agencies like the Metropolitan Area Planning Council and the MPO. And this runs both from the planning level and sort of regional priorities into funding, and the MPO is obviously a critical aspect of this, into implementation of projects like Hubway, which is a regional collaboration. So that level of regional engagement, I think, has only increased over recent years, and I think has resulted in some really, creative approaches and some new services for Cambridge residents. So I think that's a really important piece of what we do in maintaining that and growing that, because, we try our hardest to do the best job we can within Cambridge, but, on a congestion level or a mobility level or a sustainability level, if we need to be encouraging others and working with others to do similar things. And I know last week, the city manager was at a event in Trinity unveiling this regional partnership, which is, I think a lot about economic development, but also about the transportation aspect to it as well. So these types of initiatives are only growing. I know one thing that people are interested in is the status of the Green Line, so we just wanted to pause for a second, I guess, and give a quick update on where that's at, because there's been a lot of activity over the last couple of weeks, and we've been to a couple of meetings recently. Basically, what's happened is that because of the pretty much 50% increase in cost, the project has been is in the midst of being reevaluated, reassessed. One of the things you can see in this diagram on the right is basically this: if built as currently budgeted, it would be by far the most expensive light rail project ever built in the United States on a per mile basis. So this has given a lot of pause to the T and to MassDOT. So their project delivery method, the so-called construction management general contractor, has not worked out as they planned. So they're looking at two options. One, and they're, I would say, seriously considering both of these options. One is to cancel the project completely, despite the money that's been invested and the work that's taken place to date, or look at options to substantially reduce the cost of the project. And they just passed a resolution in the meeting today that indicated that the Commonwealth does not intend to provide additional funding for this project, so they expect that additional money to come from some combination of MPO funds, so basically federal funds that are allocated at the regional level, or from municipalities, private developers, other sources that might be interested in paying for this. So while they're also looking at scaling back the cost to get rid of that $1 billion cost overrun that they're projecting, they're also looking for additional funds. So that's a whole big discussion that we need to have, not necessarily tonight, but I just wanted to give people preview of that. What they're looking at in terms of reducing costs that affects us specifically is scaling back the stations. So rather than having something that's more like what you see at Assembly Row with full fare control and heating and full canopies, maybe something more like what you see on other parts of the Green Line, in Boston or in Brookline, or like the Yawkey station that was built on the commuter rail recently. So something a little bit simpler. They are looking at potentially not building the branch to Union Square, which not only does that impact Union Square, but I think there's also an accessibility piece for Inman Square as well, since it's relatively close by. So that's something that they're looking at. That's something I'm doing. And then they're also looking at some of the design and potentially some changes to the design of the community path, which is something that the city is very committed to, even though it's basically outside our borders, but it's important enough to us that we've included it in our bicycle network plan. So next steps from them is they're revising the design. They hope to have something by next spring to look at, looking at new project delivery, new procurement approaches, and they have, you may have caught in the news last week, they basically fired all of their consultants and contractors and are looking at hiring new ones to do this work. So as I mentioned, we are going to be asked to look at financial contributions to this, whether directly from the city or by leveraging our private partners. We're going to continue actively to keep an eye on the status of the project. And I think, we've certainly been clear that our goal is to see this project move forward, acknowledging that the cost increases that they've seen are not sustainable and not something, we understand they need to look at it again, but we certainly would not support, canceling the project in its entirety. So I'm going to turn over to Suzanne to talk about policies and the trends that we see in transportation in these regions.
Does that sound like a good level? Okay, great. I'm going to talk first about what we are trying to get out of our transportation system, and we really have a dual focus on both having the safest possible system and also a transportation system that contributes to our sustainability goals. Of course, safety is paramount, and that includes all modes of transportation, and that needs to always come first. Our environmental goals are met if we have a transportation system that reduces vehicle congestion and promises better air quality, and that's both in terms of traditional air pollutants, but also greenhouse gas emissions, of course, are an incredibly important factor. And then a street system, other than transporting people, it also transports stormwater, so the street system contributes to a great extent to helping meet our stormwater goals. We, of course, only benefit from our transportation system if it also supports our economy, and we need to design our system such that we can continue to have a very healthy economy for all who live in Cambridge. And more and more transportation is seen as a way of contributing to healthy living because people actually are physically active if they can use sustainable modes to meet their mobility needs. Safety is, our focus have more and more been on the 8 to 80 community, which means that people should be able to travel safely, whether they're very young or very old or in between. So it really influences how we are going about designing our system so that it is possible to travel by yourself if you're within that age group. The environmental impact is, I think this slide probably tells all. It's obvious that the more people you can move with the fewer vehicles, the better off you are. And you have the added benefit that streets that are not dominated by cars tend to actually contribute in great measure to people's social interactions. It's easier to cross the street to meet your friends, and it's more enjoyable to be outside and sit at sidewalk cafes or walk around the city. We know from a lot of research that we've been doing that relying on sustainable modes really helps strengthen our economy, and that's not necessarily intuitive, but people who walk and bicycle and take transit tend to shop locally and actually tend to shop more frequently locally than when people use cars. So we see the promotion of sustainable modes not just helping our air quality and the environment overall, but also actually directly contributing to strengthening local business and our local economy. And creating a transportation network that allows for active transportation leads to healthier communities, and that means that you don't have to spend extra time to go to the gym or otherwise sort of be healthy by doing additional things. It's built into your everyday life, and it has lots and lots of research. And I should say again that a lot of the work we do is heavily influenced by our understanding that comes from research and experience elsewhere. And for example, we know kids that bike to school are much more awake when they get to school and much more ready to actually learn. So there's very many multiplying benefits. And this slide to the right is just an example of sort of using part of our transportation system to also have, of course, lots of policy guidance to rely on in our work, and that's been something the city uniquely has had for a very long time. The vehicle trip reduction ordinance is now, I think, almost 25 years old, and we've been doing parking and transportation demand management by regulation also for close to 20 years. More recently, we've been adding some comprehensive planning around well, climate change for sure, but also the transit strategic plan and the new bicycle plan presentations you've had recently from staff that helps further focus our work in these areas. So specifically, when we think about transportation, we are focused on 4 major categories. We, of course, need to and want to engage with people around how the transportation system works, what their opportunities are, how they can improve their mobility needs. And there's a lot going on in that arena, and increasingly so. Reducing the traffic impact of development is a huge focus, as is adapting our infrastructure to, as I mentioned earlier, enable people of all ages and abilities to use sustainable modes and safely travel around the city, and of course also meeting our stormwater retention goals. And as Joe just mentioned, the regional work is essential part of what we do, especially around transit, as the transit system, as you know, is not under our control for the most part, and there are major challenges. Just very briefly hitting on some of these priorities. We have been doing outreach and education for a long time, but and I didn't bring specific numbers, but there has been a huge surge lately in people's interest in trainings that we offer, especially around bicycling. And we have sort of broken through, I would say, and we're now very active in the schools, and lots of interest in bicycling in the population and amongst young people, and also city employees, as a matter of fact. So in the last year or so, there's been a big uptake, and at some point we can show you some statistics around like how many more people are engaged with us directly in receiving these kinds of trainings. We have added in the last year and a half, or maybe only the last year actually, the Safe Routes to School program where we're now engaged in 6 schools, and next year it's growing to at least a total of 9 schools, focused on getting children to school, walking, biking, or taking the bus in a safe manner. And it's a highly popular program with the kids and as well as parents. The impact of development takes up a lot of our time and effort, because there, as you know, is a huge amount of development going on. So we're very focused on both controlling the demand, meaning ensuring that only those people who absolutely need to drive will be driving when new buildings are built, and that we adapt the infrastructure to make it possible for all other modes to access new locations. And the special permit, both the zoning process and the special permit review process is where these things become reality, and developers are participating in improving our, both limiting demand for driving and improving the facilities for everyone else, including, of course, parking facilities. The infrastructure, the focus on adapting the infrastructure, again, has to do with enabling people of all ages, and that's what is referred to as the complete streets approach. So every single street in our city, of course, to varying degrees and depending on what the exact type of street it is, but that every single street can accommodate safely all modes of transportation. And the vehicle for that, and Kathy will talk a lot more about that in a moment, but a major vehicle for making these changes happen is through the DPW 5-year plan for street and sidewalk reconstruction, where major investment is made that enables us to do things like Weston Avenue that you see here, and also enables us to address our stormwater management strategy. We increasingly are also expanding our infrastructure in different ways, and this is a different kind of infrastructure, but new technologies make it possible. New technologies are changing the transportation system, and here's just an example of transit infrastructure through the transit screens where real-time information is now being made available to people that helps make it much faster and easier to know how to use the public transportation system. And we've just conducted some surveys around this, and it's very, very popular to have that information available. And we're hoping to pilot transit priority treatment so that we can move our buses through the city much better than we are now, and not having them hung up in traffic the way they often are. And in addition to sort of helping with the existing, giving advantages to the existing transit system, we do need to look for new service opportunities, and that is a very difficult conversation to have right now given the state of affairs at the state level, but we are looking for new strategies, and also the city, ways in which the city can potentially contribute to improving the transit system through funds that are being raised through development impact fees. And I think that's it for the sort of like what are the priorities behind our transportation activities. Quickly, I'm going to quickly run through some trend information just so you have that available. So Cambridge is a city that has achieved a lot more and has done a lot more and achieved a lot more than I would argue most other places in the country. And we have been receiving a lot of recognition for what we've been doing to enable people to travel by sustainable modes. And we are continuously gathering information around what does that mean in terms of who uses what mode and how do those trends change over time. And I just say, and somehow it doesn't say Cambridge at the top bar. We lost apparently every other city, but I tell you the top one is Cambridge. So Cambridge is very far ahead in the nation in terms of how residents get around. 24% of people walk to work, which is extraordinary. And of course, that is partly because of our mixed use, or a significant contributor is the fact that we have very mixed use development, and we're both a center for homes, but also a center for work. So people have that opportunity. But to have 31% combined work and walk and bike mode is extremely high, and you can see that reflected here. And these are updated numbers. I think either 2014 or 2013. So just very quickly go through these just to show you that no matter what kind of data set we look at, we see the same trend line. So people drive less and people use other modes more. So whether it's public transit, walking, biking, it's all going up. And this is comparing 1990 with 2010. So this is not the very latest, but all other figures show the same thing. And it seems like we've been losing a little bit of some headings here. I'll have to guess. One of them is residents. Let's just see. Okay, sorry. This is commuters. This is residents. So same thing. Driving is down. Other modes are up. If we look at parking permits, same thing. This is comparing households in the red bar with resident permits in the blue bar. So it's the number of households are increasing, and and the number of resident permits are going down. It didn't include it, but if you look at the number of households that don't have a car, that's also an upward trend. Oh, there it is. There it is. Next one. And people using transit is up, whether it's walking or biking. And this is just one example, and I could show you like 10 different slides, but here's one example showing that we're pretty much sort of either holding steady or slightly declining in terms of our cars on the road. And this is per day, so I'm using the average daily traffic, because it's true that if you have very high levels of congestion in the peak hour, you can't push more than a certain number of cars through. So you could have growth in traffic, but it wouldn't show up in the peak if you only look at peak hour. But if you look at daily, that is all the cars in a day, and this is averaged out over several days. And I just point to, this line up here. So what you're seeing here, this is Land Boulevard and O'Brien Highway traffic numbers. And this line up here is what the Kendall Square Urban Renewal Project said would happen. There was a prediction for the 20-year prediction for the future before the project started. And the blue line is what happened in reality. So it's sort of been bouncing up and down, but we are in a kind of a very similar pattern, relatively flat, and nowhere near what our original projections said was going to happen. So I think that's just a sort of quick sense of what the trend lines are.
Okay, now I'm going to go through a little bit about sort of our overall infrastructure improvement program and talk about, some of the key projects people have seen, and really want to emphasize, how our infrastructure program really supports our transportation priorities. So Suzanne referenced a little bit the 5-year plan. We created this plan probably about 8 years ago with really the impetus to increase the coordination. So the coordination amongst people around this table, as well as the community, other utility companies, and really to let people know where construction is going to be coming down the road so they can plan accordingly. And so we've been very successful in being able to pull in people, coordinate with the gas company, coordinate with other departments, and really increase our interaction with the community about various projects. So we focus a lot on what Suzanne talked about, sort of the Complete Streets program, and that's really looking at all the different users. I think, one of the things we really emphasize as well is really accessibility. So looking at making sure our streets and sidewalks work for people that use wheelchairs, that use walkers, that push strollers, and all the different users in the public realm. So this is a map that I know is extremely hard to read at this scale, but it's basically the 5-year plan, and it outlines where construction is going to be over the next 5 years. And what you can see is that, the city has a significant commitment to our infrastructure. And so we've got a lot of projects going on, we've got a lot of projects coming up, and it's really focused on, looking at our existing utilities, our sewer, our drain, our water system, as well as looking at our streets and sidewalks. And so when you look at sort of the different pots of funds that the city has for infrastructure, they really fall into 3 major categories. So one is our utility projects. So those are the larger sewer and drain projects that we talk about. And those are generally funded at about $25 to $30 million a year. And that really is the sort of the West Cambridge construction that people are very familiar with, the Huron-Concord, the Western Ave construction, the upcoming construction in the port. And those really fall under that larger utility construction funding. We also have larger, what I call the sort of square projects. So that's like Harvard Square, Kendall Square, Main Street coming up, that's ongoing. And generally those are funded every couple of years. We get a major square project, and they tend to run between $5 and $10 million per project. And then we also have the sort of more straightforward street and sidewalk programs, and we sometimes call those Chapter 90 projects. Those tend to be the 2nd Street, the Meade Street, Fulkerson Street, Mount Auburn Street, just thinking about some of the more recent ones. In those projects, we get $2.5 million on average from Mass DOT, which we call sort of Chapter 90. So sometimes you'll hear us call Chapter 90 projects. And then we also get $2 million, generally, the city has committed moving forward. So we get about $4.5 million for those projects. So those are sort of the major pots of funds. And I'll go through a couple examples for each of those. And I would say, really over the last number of years, you've seen a real increase in our commitment to community process, so both during the design phase as well as during the construction phase. And this is, where Yaron talked about, there's a lot of coordination between CDD and Public Works about those types of projects. And depending on the specific project, sometimes we'll be the lead and sometimes CDD will be the lead. But what you're seeing is really an increased commitment to working with the community, both during the design to figure out what should go back on the streets, what the streets should look like, how they should function, as well as sort of ongoing coordination throughout construction. So I just want to focus a little bit. These are, I have a couple series of slides about Western Ave. This is really our most recently completed major utility project. And it started with an emphasis on, deteriorating utilities, so drains, sewer, and again, water. And that was really the impetus behind the project. But it really gave us an opportunity to work with the community, and really CDD led the effort in terms of the streetscape design of how should the street be put back. We need to do a significant amount of construction. What changes do people want to see? And so, the bottom, the left photo is the before, and on the right is the after. You see the raised cycle track, an extensive number of new street trees, planting areas, maintained parking, curb extensions to enhance pedestrian crossings, and a lot of significant improvements to the avenue. And here you see on the left is some of the utility construction. So again, we recognize that this construction can be fairly disruptive for people. It's a significant enhancement of the infrastructure. There's a new stormwater outfall. That's the sort of middle photo up above. That was the construction in the Charles River. So again, looking at the overall stormwater management, making sure we're improving those. On the bottom right is the photo of porous asphalt that went in the cycle track. So again, these are sort of some overall images of the Western Avenue, and it's really an opportunity to also look at what are the open spaces like. So we're trying to look at these projects as complete as possible. And really you can see some of the enhanced pedestrian crossings. And I think Jack had a little bit of thoughts. We've been talking earlier.
So back 20 years ago, we used to call Western Avenue the Wild West. We could put officers down there 24/7, walk away from it for a day, and the same problems would exist. Now we're not finding speed, we're not finding major conflict between pedestrians and cars. It's everything they did to engineer that road has taken a lot of the enforcement out of the way. And now it's just a matter of maintaining through enforcement every once in a while.
Kathy, you might just mention that we have attempted with the state to see if we could control the traffic lights that cross the river, particularly at Weston and River, and all the congestion that occurs, really down to the Magazine Beach in the evening. We feel that if they would give us control of those lights and we could assume responsibility, we would be able to affect even better, flow of traffic in a safe mode across the river. And to date, they've been reluctant to do that. We continue to bring that up every chance we get.
And just the other point, I think, Suzanne talked a lot about transit, and I think transit's one of the modes we're trying to bring more into our planning. So as you look at Western Ave, there was emphasis on looking at where the bus stops are located, looking where there should be bus shelters and benches and other amenities. And so I think that's the sort of, we sort of talk about modes catching up over time, and, transit's one mode that we're trying to sort of bring in, and again, recognizing that we don't control the transit system, but, what can we as the city do to improve operations? So next I want to talk a little bit about the Alewife Sewer Separation Project. So this is sort of the Huron A, Huron B, and Concord Ave contracts. And these are really part of the Boston Harbor cleanup. And so they're court ordered to do sewer separation, remove all the any combined sewer overflows from these neighborhoods from the Alewife Brook. So as of the end of this year, which is coming very soon, so I'm happy to report we are on schedule to complete the sewer separation, which means that as of the end of the year, all the stormwater from these contract areas will be going to the newly constructed Alewife wetland and then to the Alewife Brook, and so they'll be completely separated systems. And so that's been a huge effort, and we'll get into some photos showing some of the construction impacts, and we recognize what the trade-offs are from the community, but sort of looking long-term, there's significant environmental benefits of these projects. So this is a photo of the Alewife, the stormwater wetland. So if people haven't been out there, I strongly encourage people to go. It's back behind the T, behind Cambridge Park Drive, and it's where, again, all the stormwater from those contract areas will go. And in addition to being, a significant infrastructure component, it's really a community benefit. There's boardwalks, there's paths. It's really created a new park area. So I think as we look at these projects, we look at, trying to maximize the number of co-benefits. So, we look at it from very much of an infrastructure perspective, but also, how can you make these areas places that people can use? So this is some of the construction in Alewife. And again, these utility projects, they're very large infrastructure. It can be very disruptive on neighborhood streets. And then at the end, it can be really nice improvements. So these are a couple of the completed streets, looking at the sidewalks, the streets, and new street trees. There's 300 new street trees going in the area. I think there's 33,000 linear feet of water main, 5 or 6 miles of new gas mains. So significant infrastructure improvements throughout this neighborhood. And again, recognizing that the construction is challenging, but the long-term benefits from transportation, as well as from basic infrastructure to transportation, environmental trees, is really significant. So this is, we've had a couple of council order updates recently looking at the port, and that's really the next large infrastructure project that's coming. And so we'll just beginning the design process in the spring. And so we'll really start outreaching to the community and having similar conversations about the infrastructure pieces we need to do, as well as, the street and sidewalk and transportation pieces people want to incorporate into the project.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Will that expand throughout the rest of the neighborhood, or that is the total focus of?
So the red streets here are the total focus for that area. Yep, and this will likely be broken up into 2 or 3 contracts. We're still trying to figure out what the right phasing is. So different than the Alewife, this is not court ordered, and so the timing can be a little more up to us and what makes sense in terms of the impacts to the neighborhood. This is just a couple photos of the Kendall Square Main Street project that's underway. And this is, again, we had talked about sort of the larger square projects that the city's been funding every couple of years. So again, you can see the deteriorated sidewalk, and on the right is some, pretty extensive excavation to improve the street tree plantings with sand-based structural soil. And this is starting to come to fruition. You're starting to see the completion of the sidewalks and improvements there. And these are this is an example of some of what we call the Chapter 90, which are the more straightforward street and sidewalk projects. Typically don't involve significant utility construction, but do involve street sidewalks. We look at bicycle and pedestrian accommodations and ways we can make improvements. This is an example of what the before condition on the left was on Broadway. And again, you can see, very deteriorated pedestrian ramps with puddles at the bottom. And on the right, you can see what we call sort of the raised side street detail, where the pedestrians really have the priority and emphasis. And again, you alleviate any of that kind of ponding at the bottom of the pedestrian ramp. I think this is my last Chapter 90 project, and this is Longfellow Road, which is a small residential street. And this was one where the residents were really pushing us, saying, the sidewalks are so narrow that we can't do new street trees. This is really, we want to be able to have street trees and pedestrians, and how do we do that with this limited amount of space? So this is really the first residential shared street that we've done. And so bikes, peds, cars all share that main street. And then we sort of converted what was the traditional very narrow, inaccessible sidewalk into really planting and more beneficial space. And so this has been extremely well supported by the neighborhood. They've really gone in and maintained those planting areas, and it's been quite successful in terms of thinking about how we use the public space for more creative ways. So again, that's sort of the summary, and this really follows through with the 5-year plan, laying out those priorities. And I think Jack's going to go into a little bit about sort of the crashes and how those have seen over the years. We've seen pretty dramatic decreases in the number of crashes that the city has seen. So with that, I'll turn it over.
So we've provided in several of the pedestrian, bicycle, and traffic committees over the last 2 years some indications that bike trips were increasing dramatically. I believe Jeff Bryant's report from 2008 to 2012 was showing a 200-plus bike trip count increase through the city of Cambridge. What we're seeing the next year in 2013, 2014, and again in 2015 was a dramatic decrease in bike crashes in the city. We're also seeing a decrease in pedestrian crashes. So again, you can see the crash rate overall for all types of crashes is dropping. The last numbers that have been produced for this chapter is 2012, but we're seeing that trend to continue to drop significantly over the last 2 years. And a lot of the reduction in crashes for pedestrians, bikes, to, over the last 20 years, to plan for efficient and safe transportation for everybody has really panned out in these numbers. And these numbers really prove out that everything that we're doing in the city is working. And it used to be that enforcement was the first step that anyone took to address any answer on the roadway. Well, now it's the last piece of it. It's now engineering, education, and enforcement. And we can see with the numbers that we're reporting over the last 3 years that everything that we're doing is moving in the right direction. And again, you can see the pedestrian crashes again, 2014, 2015, we're seeing significant decreases again in those numbers. And then again, the total crashes, 2013, and they just continue to fall each year. And that's what I have for the numbers.
So I'm going to be parochial for a minute and just talk about my department. Since it's been just about 9 months since I had my first interaction with the council as a director back in March. But I would say that, it became clear to me that, my department wasn't, and probably never will be, but certainly wasn't at that time, everyone's favorite department in the city. So we're trying to work on sort of what we do internally. So I want to talk for just a few minutes about that since I guess technically I'm not the newest department head here since Iran was made officially the department head after me, but she's sort of been around for a lot longer than I have. So just talk a little bit about organizational changes, some of our strategic priorities, and then some initiatives you'll see coming up, and some of this is also in response to some requests we've gotten from the council. So one thing I wanted to just mention was our organizational chart, which hopefully is a little bit clearer than it had been in the past. And I also want to take the opportunity to introduce the two people in charge of the two divisions, street management and parking management. So Brad Garrett, who most of you probably know, who's been with the department for many years, is the assistant director for parking management now. And Brooke McKenna, who started with us just about a month ago, is the assistant director for street management. And so you can see the different pieces of the organization that are their responsibility, along with an administrative group as well. But part of this is just to clarify organizational structure internally, but a big part of it is also designed to meet the additional challenges that we see coming in the future, whether that's in terms of technology, whether that's in terms of customer service or capital planning. We need to be doing, there's a number of areas where we feel like we need to be doing a better job, and having a very good organizational chart and the right people in that organizational chart is a really important part of that. We're doing a fair amount of hiring. We continue to do so, of filling in gaps, not necessarily new positions, but things that have been vacant. And so I think in the next 3 to 6 months, you'll see a lot of new faces, but I think hopefully are already starting to see some new energy from the department as we move forward. So some of the priorities that I have for the department is really focused on customer service, whether that's how people pay parking or how they get a permit to move or park their moving truck. But also just customer service training and upgrading what we do. One thing we did, I think, really effectively with the police department was we did a management of aggressive behavior training for our parking control officers, which I think was a great opportunity for them to learn a little bit how to interact with the public when they're maybe not at their best as they're out in the street. And so I think that was a good example of a partnership with the police, but also a good opportunity for our staff. We're also looking at better integrating technology into what we do, whether that's smart meters and allowing people to pay by phone, which is something that many other communities are already doing, and we're sort of a little bit behind on. Suzanne mentioned transit signal priority and allowing buses to move more quickly through intersections, and then just how we communicate with our signals, or currently how we don't communicate with our signals remotely, and upgrading that. We also want to make sure that we're being as effective as we can on the operational side, so whether that's looking at better work order management and asset management systems, which is something we currently don't really do very much of at our end, although DPW has certainly done a lot of that at their end. Enhancing our snow operations, and like I said, staff training is a big part of this, making sure people have access to the skills that they need and are able to do their work effectively. In terms of sustainability, we're also looking at things like, we're working very closely actually with Suzanne's group and looking at putting solar panels on the roof of one of our garages, so things like that, or LED lighting to be more sustainable. Better inventory management, we don't even necessarily know exactly what we have and how we're using it, so doing things like that. And I think also to the sort of triple bottom line of sustainability that Suzanne mentioned earlier, I think the fact that my department continues to offer, for people who don't have necessarily, don't have to have a college degree, don't have to have a lot of experience, offers good, well-paying, benefited jobs, I think is an important piece of what we do. And I'm not necessarily something I would have expected when I started, but I'm sort of proud of the fact that we continue to offer that opportunity in a world where a lot of those types of opportunities are going away. And so, continuing to, have a good staff of park control officers, have a good operations staff is a really important part of what we do every day. And so finally, just a couple of initiatives that we are working on that we'll hopefully start to see in the near future. Pay by phone, which would allows people to pay for parking meters on the app on their smartphone. We intend to pilot that in the Harvard Square area starting in the spring. We have about ready to sign a contract with a vendor to do that for us. And then we would expand beyond that based on the results of that pilot implementation. So that's something that we're very, very excited about and very committed to getting done this spring. We're also looking at piloting smart meters, which again, another technology option for people to pay for their meter, but we're also looking at the costs and benefits of this, that they're not cheap to buy and they're also not cheap to operate on a monthly basis. And so we need to make sure we're making the right technology decisions, not just jumping in to whatever the new latest thing is, but actually being very deliberate about how we invest, and not just in terms of the initial cost, but also the operating costs going forward. And then, very excited about looking at transit signal priority for the bus system, and we're working on a pilot with the MBTA right now and hope to be testing that during the first half of next year, along with upgrading how our signals communicate. And we're also looking at some fairly, significant upgrades to the First Street garage, just to keep it in good state of good repair and make sure that it is available for the public and for the businesses around there for the long term. So again, that's just kind of a quick preview of where we're headed. I did want to take a minute just to bring it back to my daily stuff, because it is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, and I want to make sure everyone's aware that we are, changing the way we do business and improving every day. So the last part is just to sort of talk about the future and give you guys some thoughts on where we're headed in general, and also things that are coming at us that we have to deal with, as well as things that we want to put a priority on going forward. So Suzanne's going to talk about a few things.
So we've been doing planning around cycling for a long time, but it's become clearer and clearer that what needs to happen is better separation of cyclists from the rest of the moving vehicles. So whereas before our focus was primarily on striping bike lanes, we're now really looking at as many opportunities as possible, and in particular on the major streets, as you'll see in the bike plan, for separation that allows, that will improve safety and allow a broader range of people to be able to cycle. And one of the key factors of cycling safety has to do with large vehicles. If you look at crash statistics, unfortunately those that end up as fatalities or very severe injuries are, the overwhelming majority are because of trucks and large vehicles. So an initiative that Public Works Department is working on right now, that I'm hoping to introduce to everyone else in the city who uses trucks or hires people that use trucks, is to install sidecars, because it has a major impact on preventing very severe injury or death. So these are both very important foci right now. Healthy and active living, as I talked about earlier, is a bigger and bigger issue, and there's a lot of collaboration between our departments and also the Public Health Department around transportation as a way of being active in a broad range of people being active, which requires something else out of our transportation system than we have necessarily been designing for up until recently. And of course, transportation is a contributor to greenhouse gas pollutants, and we are heading in a direction where we need to start thinking about long-term reaching carbon neutrality, and the transportation system needs to play its part in being able to meet that goal. It's not nearly as big as the built environment, but it is a factor when we know that we need to get to total carbon neutrality from all of our activities. And then, as you all know, there's a lot going on in transportation in terms of new systems and technologies being introduced. And these are, some of these have been experienced as disruptive. They came upon us faster than, and the regulatory system did not quite know how to respond. But yet things are becoming more mainstream, but it still requires a lot of us to be able to accommodate car sharing, Uber, Lyft, Bridge, which is the new on-demand transit system. All of these things are coming very rapidly and taking hold, and we need to be able to find a way to accommodate them in a way that doesn't have detrimental impacts on other parts of our system. So this is things we haven't had to deal with before that can have a very positive impact, but it needs to be understood and integrated in a good way.
Just a few others before we finish up. We have not always taken a proactive approach to how we manage freight goods in the city, and so I think we're looking at needing to take that more seriously and really study that at the local level and kind of curb regulations and truck routes and all that kind of stuff, and kind of get a better handle on that piece, but also look at it at a regional level, whether that's truck sizes, coordination with other municipalities, and looking at the regional truck routings, not just the local truck routings. So there's a lot of partnerships needed for that, both with other agencies and other municipalities, but also with the businesses that do the deliveries. And so that's, I think, going to be an emerging area for all of us. One thing I know a lot of the councilors have mentioned is sort of these new mobility devices, whether that's electric vehicles, whether that's e-bikes, and unfortunately, Vice Mayor Benson, I was not able to find a picture of you on an e-bike in Amsterdam, or else I would have used that instead. Or these hoverboard things, which, as someone, I think Jack pointed out, they may just all catch fire, and we may not have to deal with them. But in general, I think there are new classes of devices out there. We're challenged enough to figure out how to accommodate the modes that we've had around for 100 years. As these new things come about, we have to figure out how we handle them as well, and we can't always control whether they work or are popular with people, and we just have to be able to figure out what we do with them when they arrive. And then finally, I think, we've all talked about this, but enhancing transit, whether that's dealing with capacity issues through new buses or improvements to the signal system on the Red Line, which is something, again, we can't do alone, obviously. We need to be working with the T and working with others, both on the funding and the implementation side, or things that are a little bit more under our control, like transit signal priority, and allowing buses to move more quickly within the city. So with that, I think we've done probably more than enough talking, and so we'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Mayor. Happy to answer any questions or expand on anything we've said before.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor?
We have Councilor Turner and Councilor Keller.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. I just have two quick points, two questions. First, on the talked about the pedestrian and bicycle crashes. But the question I've always wanted: when we have intersection, four ways, traffic lights, why we don't have the pedestrians all crossing at the same time? Then traffic in both directions stop. And just referencing right out here on Emma Street, when the cars are coming down here, they have a green light, but the pedestrians have the light to cross too. So, I mean, it kind of, I think, creates a conflict. Wouldn't it make more sense that there's a red light for everybody and the pedestrians in both crosswalks can cross more safely? Is there a reason why that's not done? Because if the pedestrians in the crosswalk going across towards the post office, the cars then are backed up because they can't take the turn. So we're creating more of a backlog on that. So I'm just curious why all those intersections that people just all cross at the same time. Everyone has the walk signal in both directions.
Sure. So, and there's sort of differing schools of thought on this, but I guess I'll take the first shot and others can jump in if they feel the need. But basically, I think our general approach is to have what are called the concurrent pedestrian signals, where pedestrians cross kind of with the traffic. And there's a few different reasons for that. The main one I would say is that it actually reduces the delay for pedestrians, because usually what happens when you have the all pedestrian phase is then you have to press a button, or at the very least wait for that to come up, and it will only come up occasionally in the cycle. And so out of the total hour of time you might have or the 3,600 seconds you have in an hour, you're going to get less of it devoted to time for pedestrians to cross, so they wind up experiencing greater delay. There is certainly the issue that you mentioned about potential conflicts with vehicles, and I think two pieces to that. One is our general approach is we want, whether they're at crosswalks at a traffic signal or whether they're an unsignalized crosswalk or anywhere, we want drivers to yield to pedestrians in a crosswalk. And so the idea is that if everyone's behaving the way they should, then those conflicts should be resolved in favor of the pedestrian. When we do have locations where we have particularly high pedestrian volumes and a lot of turning traffic, then we will sometimes still put in an exclusive phase for pedestrians. I think an example of that is the signal, which even though it's on a DCR roadway, we actually control at Mass Ave and Elmwood Parkway, where there is an exclusive pedestrian phase that's brought up by a button because of the volumes of traffic, turning traffic, there's heavy left turns, things like that. And so we do control it. The one out here, if I'm remembering correctly, I believe if someone is crossing Mass Ave when Inman Street has the green light, they're actually probably crossing against the light because I believe that it's an exclusive for pedestrians crossing Mass Ave. So in that case, it is actually designed to allow for that to be an conflict-free movement for the pedestrians. So there's a few different reasons we do it, and I think on balance we feel like it's the right approach for a city like Cambridge, where we want pedestrians to feel like they have the right of way, and we want drivers to feel like they need to yield to pedestrians. And I guess I would say that the other significant place I can think of, which very consistently has that as a policy, is New York City, where you're not going to find a location with more pedestrians than New York City. And so I think it is a common feature of places that have a lot of pedestrians to use this technology. It can result in a little more delay for vehicles, but we think that that's the right trade-off to make. And I'll just mention also that I know over the years talked to the Michael Mewey at the Commission on Disabilities, and they feel comfortable that this is the right approach for people who have vision impairments as well.
And we did research years ago on a number of intersections where we had exclusive setup for pedestrians, and we saw a very high degree of disobedience, pedestrians crossing against the light all the time because they were simply unwilling to accept the length of delay that you introduce when you have everybody come in sequence. The signal, overall signal cycle just becomes much longer. And I think you can see if you go to the city of Boston, where they still, in very many intersections, have the exclusive pedestrian phase, and there's just rampant failure on the behalf of pedestrians to wait for the light. So, and I think we should also tie back to our crash statistics, and we don't see an increase in crashes as a result of the policy that we have, which is also very, not only in New York City, but in many, many places throughout Europe, and it's a very standard way of operating signals the way we do it, that results in much greater adherence on the part of pedestrians to actually crossing when they have the light.
Well, let me ask, I'm not certainly a traffic engineer, but when the pedestrian light for the pedestrians to cross from this part of Mass Ave to that part of Mass Ave, what is the traffic light? Is that green or is that red?
When pedestrians are allowed to cross Mass Ave, all of the traffic signals for cars are red. Basically, nobody else can move other than pedestrians. The pedestrians have an exclusive. When Mass Ave is allowed to go, then people can cross Inman Street, but since it's a one-way street, in that case, there's actually no conflict at all because no one can turn on Inman Street.
I understand that. I'm not talking about from this side of Mass Ave to the other side.
This side, Mass Ave to the other
Green,
side.
I believe it's a green light, and the pedestrians have the right to walk. It says walk. I'll double check. I want to leave it tonight, but I'm
If I
on.
remember correctly, it's exclusive at that point, and everybody is red.
So the car and the pedestrian both have the right of way.
No, the car should not move. Ideally, cars have a red light. Pedestrians have the walking person.
So the cars on Mass Ave and Inman Street are both stopped at the same time?
If I'm remembering correctly.
I'll have to check them out. I know there's other intersections that, I'm gonna check what I did tonight, but I know there's other sections where there's a 5-second delay from going to red to the green and pedestrians cross, and I believe the cars can go too, so.
I mean, this is
I just-
probably an exception, most, like, if you go down to Prospect Street, there, the pedestrians move at the same time as the cars.
Well, I would think the 30-second delay for a pedestrian would be much more safely, and I guess you can refer this also to the police department, just reading about Boston hasn't given no, they've had a number of fatalities, pedestrians, and one of the big issues is because of, you know, it's $1.05 a jaywalking, the police don't enforce that. I mean, is that something that should be re-examined of pedestrians to know that it is illegal to cross against?
Yeah, I think, as Suzanne mentioned, I think one of the advantages we've seen with the way we use our traffic signals is that pedestrians do tend, I mean, not 100% certainly, but I think as compared to Boston and other places that have more of the exclusive phases, that pedestrians do tend to wait for the time when they are allowed to cross. So even if they might have a conflict with the turning vehicle at that time, they do have the right of way legally, and so they're, you know, we're trying to train the drivers to make sure that they pay attention to that.
I know the drivers are coming down Nimbus Street trying to make that light to get, you know, it's scary at times. But I just asked that you look at some intersections to see maybe on a trial basis to see if something like that would be beneficial for both the pedestrians and bicyclists. The other question is on bicycles, and I know that during the day, and we've all seen the police giving information to bicyclists during the day. One friend of mine, every time I run into him, asks about, do the police do that at night, especially for bicyclists that do not have headlights, which is so dangerous, and why bicyclists do not have headlights and dressed all in dark clothing, and you can't see them. So that I can answer them, because I'm going to see them at Christmas time. Do the police do any type of activity at night with bicyclists to inform them that, hey, you should have a helmet or a light on your bicycle?
So we have 3 different highway grants that we work under, 2 of them primarily for pedestrian and bicycle enforcement, and the vast majority of those dollars is spent at night from 4 o'clock to midnight. And we take every opportunity that we can stop the bicyclist, educate them on lighting, on good visibility, wearing a helmet, safety issues, but lighting where that is a violation that they can't be cited for. That's one thing that we will remind them of the opportunity to do.
Do you have anything that can send you to the office like this?
Sure thing.
Defend yourself. Craig.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming here. I just have a few comments. One is the trends in sustainable commuting. Cambridge is the highest in residents who bicycle to walk or work, but I just took a quick look at the top 5, and Cambridge is by far the smallest, and it pretty much goes up in order. The bigger the city, the smaller the percentage. So I think it's always important that when we look at statistics, we make sure that we're figuring out why we're looking at them and whether they're relevant and what lessons we can learn. So I don't know how useful that particular statistic is. The bike crash numbers, as I read the information from CDD, bike crashes are actually up. The percentage is down because we have a lot more cyclists, but the number of crashes is up, which is again a very important differentiation. The accidents, the crashes, the collisions seem generally to take place at turning movements. So most people here know that I'm not a big fan of curb-separated bike lanes and bikeways and so forth for a variety of reasons. The collisions take place at turning movements, and I would like to see more of an emphasis on how we could make the turning movement safer while at the same time not redesigning the streets so that cyclists get forced off onto the side in a way where my kids don't like it, I don't like it. It's a very different style of cycling. And I'm still sort of confused as to why we are building lights that don't recognize cyclists I'm waiting on the list to find out what those light signals are, and we need to figure out how to mark them for cyclists, because as a cyclist, when you sit there and you wait and you wait and you wait for a light to turn, and it doesn't turn, you really get confused as to where your place in the transportation hierarchy is. So if the lights themselves don't recognize your right to be on the road as a cyclist, it makes it very difficult to pay attention to any of the other rules. So I would like to see some sort of focus on that, and ideally get a list of the street lights, the traffic lights that are not synced for recognizing bicycles. Thank you very much.
Dennis?
Thank you all for a very thorough presentation. Really covered a lot of ground. We all know that Central Square is has the highest or near highest crash areas, at least for bikes and I think pedestrians too. So we didn't really talk about what we could do there, if anything. So I know this is a broad question. What are we going to do? What can we do, if anything? I mean, other than adding more lights at the crosswalk, street traffic lights. It's a lot of traffic comes together there, so maybe, I think it's third in the state, if I remember correctly, with accidents with bicycles. So any thoughts on that? I have heard a proposal to move bike lanes to the side streets that are parallel to Mass Avenue by Fred Salvucci, which, even though the streets aren't continuous, does make a lot of sense. I'm not sure bicyclists would go on them because they like to be in the middle of the energy, but Joe or Jack or Suzanne?
So, yeah, I can kick it off. So the bike plan has some thoughts on what kinds of treatments are appropriate for what types of streets, and of course an emphasis on separation where you have a high amount of conflicts and a high amount of volume of both bicyclists and vehicles. Central Square is a very, as you just pointed out, a very, very busy place. There's a lot of in and out. There are buses, there are delivery trucks, there are people stopping for errands. There's a tremendous volume of bicycles and pedestrians, and we need to look at all of those at the same time. And it's not, we have not advanced the planning, and it's going to be a focus for sure, probably in NASAP overall. So these are very preliminary thoughts, and we don't have any final plans. But the goods movement study that Joe mentioned earlier is also really critical, because that is also one of the issues when you constantly have delivery vehicles that are parked in bike facilities, and we want those goods. We all want to have the things we consume delivered, so it's not like we're trying to get rid of goods movement. We have to find a way of organizing all of those so they don't end up in constant conflict, because there's pulling in and out across where bicycles are and across where pedestrians are as well. So those are some of the things that we'll need to be focused on. And I think you're correct in that, and I'm not ruling out completely having better facilities on other streets for bicyclists in the right circumstances, but we have to be look very carefully at what are the sidelines and not moving people to out of the way where they're not going to go anyway.
So I believe in the mid-90s, this was actually looked at when we did the original Central Square plan. And I think my memory is we took out a travel lane coming from Kendall towards Arvin, right? And the idea there was to widen the sidewalks, create the bike lane, and to slow the speeds down. At that time, I believe people were saying, why aren't we just moving the bikes to Green Street or Bishop Allen Drive? I think the loss of parking on those streets was a real concern from a if I'm remembering this, it's a long time ago, that was part of the concern. Gary, you might have something to add to this. You may, go ahead.
So I think that if Central School were going to be rebuilt that again, then we would all be really willing to look at how everything works and all the different roads with the notion of prioritizing the modes that we've been talking about. And I think really to make significant improvements, we would have to take a full look. And right now, I think what's happening is to make sure that we understand what's happening with the goods deliveries. There was a transit analysis that was done. We have the analysis from the bicycle plan. And all of those will go into what we might imagine we can do in the future. Because I think everybody, it's not a surprise that everybody thinks it would be better than what it is now. And Mr. Rossi was right that some of the issues are what to do on the side streets. But the other primary issue is that Mass Ave is the spine of the city and it's where people want to go. So do you want to get people to those local businesses? That's where they're going, and therefore you want to provide the best facilities for them to get there. And so it's not just a through street, it's very much a destination street. And Mass Ave, as the primary spine of the city, is going to be talked about also as part of the city planning process, and that will be considered as well, how the street is used. But it's not a through street, it's a place to be on. And that's the case where you're walking. People access to businesses, and that's how we want to be thinking about transportation uses.
But having an alternative for those people who are going to MIT, and younger kids or older folks who don't want to be on the heavy traffic road, might not be a bad idea.
Well, we can talk about this, the process goes
Sure.
on. It was discussed both back in the 90s, it's discussed in the Red Plan, coming around to where people want to be, but in terms of actually coming down to design, we'll have all those conversations. But until we really sit down with all of the data and all the important information about how we want to use the street, we're not going to lead to a conclusion about the full changes that we want to do.
Related to that, is the pedestrian plan always no joke intended, in movement, meaning you're always trying to improve it and expand it, or is there an update timetable that you're hoping to meet? It might be 5 years out, don't get me wrong, I'm not asking for next month.
So we're actually looking at it right now because we're in the process of planning all our FY16 activities and laying out our whole work plan, and with the purpose of making a determination of how extensive does the update need to be. So I can't give you the answer to that question right now, other than to say, well, so there will be an update next year, but it may not be a very, very extensive update, but there are some things in it that were specific about specific locations that have been either superseded or have been carried out.
So you could give the Transportation Committee an update at that time?
Yes, absolutely.
Right, that's where I'm sitting. Joe, my favorite topic, smart meters. Everybody wants it. I can't a week doesn't go by when someone doesn't grab me and ask about this. So you said you're going to start in Harvard Square. Is that because of the tower monitors or whatever the main stations for parking? I don't know what you call them, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the
monolith.
multi-space meters.
Is that why you're starting there, or the need is greater there?
I think it's more of the latter. I think when we looked around, we certainly wanted to pilot before we go citywide, and that's certainly what's worked well elsewhere. One of the, particularly with the pay by phone piece, where people have to know to download the app and figure out how to use it. In some places, even though it sounds like a great thing, some places have seen it not really take off. And I mean, I think we were actually getting some data from Somerville in terms of what their costs were associated with it. Based on the cost of what they were doing, it was like, well, not a lot of people are using this from what we can gather. So part of it is a partnership with the businesses to get the word out about it and sort of, create some incentives and let them, be part of that, the team that gets people to know about it. So I think high parking demand. So there's, people are looking for the park there, people are looking for better solutions. So it was really based more on demand and that ability to partner effectively. Businesses, obviously, we would do that across the city as we roll out. But it seemed like a very logical place to get started.
And once you have that, would you begin to look at varied pricing based on location and time of day?
Yeah, I think that one of the things we would like to look at, I don't really have the answer yet, but is certainly, time of day is maybe, sort of a bit farther out, I think, but certainly location-based, I think, makes a lot of sense in a place like Cambridge where you have squares, that have very high demand, and then you have places, East Cambridge and other places where we have meters, and we should have meters, but the demand isn't as intense. And so we're sort of, the fact that we generally, with a few small exceptions, basically have the same rate across the city probably is not, creating the best structure for us or for our users. So I think we definitely want to look, at within sort of certain parameters, but look at, raising rates here and lowering rates in other locations.
My last comment is about Leechmere Square, Leechmere T-Station. If the city does, in the long run, participate in the financing, I hope we get a station that really respects Leechmere Square and is oriented toward Leechmere Square and not have a parking lot between the main station entry point and the square itself, and where something could be built on that parking lot and literally hide half the station. So the earlier design from the 80s actually had a major architectural expression that said entry, and you could directly walk from Leechmere Square. And the present design has nothing like that, and it's a suburban station that really doesn't relate to that part, the historic part of the city at all.
Yeah,
But that's a side point.
Yeah, and I do think, like I mentioned during the presentation, they are going to be looking at redesign of a lot of these stations, and certainly, like you mentioned, if we or the private development community is being asked to contribute to the cost of the project, then I think we played a significant role in shaping the design, but there may be some other parameters that we want to try to get involved with to make sure that it serves us as best as possible before going more money or creating opportunities for others too.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Leland.
Thanks. This is a very well done presentation. I think everyone touched on pretty much everything I had questions about. I think just to echo some of what my colleagues said, when we passed orders before about the Green Line, I think the Green Line, it's not just about Somerville, it's also going to have a huge impact in Cambridge. I'm glad to see that you're on top of that, but I think the council previously has passed an order saying, the state saying that we're interested in just throwing in our support to Somerville's leading up on the Green Line extension. To echo Councilor Carlone, we actually just talked about it today, about the smart meters. I've lost count of how many orders I've put in about smart meters. But I use them in Boston, the pay by phone, and it works great. Don't really want to wait. I don't know. Putting stickers on them seems to be not a huge amount of overhead or cost additional to replacing all the meters. I don't know, but they work really well. So whatever you can do to accelerate that, I would appreciate. I guess I had a couple of questions. One is, I guess, on Fairweather Street, there's like a bunch of these slow signs, like the yellow construction people that say like slow down, and there's a sign that says it's not a race, slow down. And I guess I was wondering, is that a pilot program, or how is that working, and can that be done in other places as well? Maybe it's not Fairweather, it's one of those streets over there. Lakeview. I guess another one is, we were also talking about, the council's previously talked about the speed limits, and potentially doing something where we can't say the speed limit is 20 to 25 miles an hour, but maybe we could do like, kids, our suggested speed limit, like suggested in really small font or whatever it is. There should be some kind of number there that says 20, 25, because it's proven that if someone's getting hit at that speed, they're much more likely to survive. I guess another question about the lights at night. So there's red lights, and it's really, I think, environmentally inefficient to stop at a red light and there's like nobody there at like 2 a.m. or if you're up, you're driving, so like why can't you turn right on red if you are sure there's like no one else around? during certain times. And the last one, I think, I actually ordered a hoverboard, so I'll let you know how that goes. Yeah, I didn't get the one that gets them on fire. But yeah, so those are some of the questions about Lakeview Street, the right on red signs and the slow speed on the signs. Thanks.
So I can start with Lakeview. So Lakeview, the variable message board is just temporary. It's up for about, I think it's up through the end of this week. And that's really because we've done a fairly new design on Lakeview. And we've had an extensive amount of community process on Lakeview about people, additional changes that people want to see on that street. It's part of the Huron E contract. It's actually the Huron A contract. And there's been, a fair amount of, I would say, disagreement. It's a fairly split community in terms of what they'd like to see changes there. So the last round of discussion that we had was to do what we call advisory bike lanes. And so those are pavement markings that have been installed. It is something that's fairly new in the city, but we think it will help facilitate to really encourage that as a bike route. It is a connection over to Fresh Pond Parkway. It's part of the signed bike route through that area. And so, but since it was a newly designed, new type of facility, we did the variable message boards really just for a transition to encourage people to use it properly. So the variable message boards are there just through the week. And then in terms of the smaller kid things, those are the things that residents have put out. They're not something that the city has put out.
In terms of the advisory speed limits, I think that certainly I agree that, and all the evidence shows that lower speeds will result in lower impacts of crashes. I think I'm always hesitant to put up signs that don't actually have a legal basis or that the police can't enforce. But I think it would be potentially interesting to look at what are the actions that we could take sort of on a more advisory educational mode to try to encourage people to drive more slowly, because I do think that the knowledge about that is limited, and so people understood what the impacts are. They might behave differently, but it would certainly need to be accompanied by some amount of research to see if they're actually effective. I think the work that we've done over the years in terms of slowing speeds with engineering measures, I think has probably been the most effective. So I would say if we've got a street where we think speeding is a problem, then we should attack it from a variety of different ways. So I don't know that, I'm not disagreeing that that's something we could look at doing. I just think it also takes a sort of coordinated approach of different pieces to make sure that these things are actually work the way we want them to. And then in terms of the traffic signals overnight, I guess it's certainly something we could look at. Some communities, put traffic signals into flashing mode in the middle of the night, at least at lower volume locations. I think we need to look at it carefully in terms of the impact on pedestrian safety and other factors. I'm personally not a big fan of right turn on red in general, and so I wouldn't want to start sort of, once you sort of allow it in the middle of the night, then people start to think, well, maybe in the middle of the day I can do it, and it becomes sort of a bit of a slippery slope. But I do think we can look at ways that we could allow, like I said, through technology or other means to not, so you don't have to sit at a traffic signal. I will mention that the new signal we installed on Binney Street, the so-called Hawk signal. Part of the reason for doing it the way it's set up is that if no one wants to cross at that location, then it has no impact on vehicular traffic. So that's a situation where if nothing's happening at 3 in the morning, then we're not just going to bring up a red signal just for the fun of it.
Mr. Mayor, one thing you mentioned the Green Line too. I think that so as I look at what I'm hearing on the Green Line, and we do speak with some of them quite often about how we are all approaching it. I think the information that I'm getting, or that came out today, I think more information tomorrow, is not a really rosy picture. It's much more about delays and significant cost overruns, reduction in the quality of the design of stations and approaches to the stations that I think we would like to see, and a solution which very much indicates they would be looking for contributions from local communities as well as developers. Now, the North Point people will tell you, I think that they have already invested more than $46 million to do things to prepare that area for the Beachman Station. They've also told the T that they're willing to take on some maintenance responsibilities when it is completed. But I think there's a big leap between between that and what delays might occur in the planning of this, and for the first time, us understanding what does it mean for a local community to contribute. So as that information comes to us, we will certainly bring it forward, but I fear that this might be a much longer delay, because I think the dilemma is really huge.
Mark?
Thank you. Just a couple nuts and bolts kind of questions, or maybe they don't seem as big as some of the other issues, but do we, how much do we enforce with our own fleet, particularly around DPW and some of the bigger trucks around the idling policy? Given, heard from a few people that, that's something that we're maybe not as good at as we should be, and I wonder what do we do to train our staff and remind our staff and make sure that they're not idling when they're not supposed to.
Councillor, I think we have come to realize that there are occasions when our staff don't necessarily do the right thing in terms of idling, and I think all of the division heads in the Department of Public Works constantly meet and constantly remind their staff in terms of safety and proper manners on the street in terms of not parking where they shouldn't be parking and not idling where they shouldn't be idling. And so we continuously reinforce to people what's appropriate in terms of driving. And again, we continue to do so, but recognize that there are occasionally problems.
And I guess this would fall to traffic. If we can get a little more enforcement, particularly around the tour buses up in Harvard Square. I mean, I go through Harvard Square quite a bit, and they're always idling. And I get it, in the summer they're idling because they have their air conditioner on and they don't want to sit there in a hot bus, and in the winter it's the heat. But the law is what it is, and if we can really step up enforcement around there, I appreciate that. What about in terms of, you talked a little bit about electric cars, and there was a policy order in a number of months ago that I put in with some others about creating more incentives for electric car ownership. Is there any conversation about moving the city towards an electric fleet of cars? I mean, we moved towards hybrid cars, and that's when we were sort of on the beginning of that, and we were sort of leading the way in that. Now, is there any talk about, as those phase out, replacing them with electric cars and moving in that direction?
Councillor, I think we continue to work with all of the other departments in the city in terms of our green fleets policy, where we look to improve the fuel efficiency of our vehicles and indeed move them to alternative energy sources to the extent that that's feasible. Obviously, that's not terribly feasible at this point in time in terms of our larger vehicles, but I think again we continuously look to move ourselves to better hybrid, better performing vehicles. And again, as more electric vehicles come online that are reasonably priced, and as long as we can continue to properly fuel those, we'll seek to do that as well.
I'd like us to look at. I mean, obviously, I know the trucks. That's a whole different ballgame. But when I think of the fleet of just passenger cars, and I think we'd advance beyond Michael Sullivan's little golf cart that he used to drive around. I think we've moved. Technology has moved well beyond that. But I think that's something that we should, the city should make a commitment to, and really move towards.
If I could just chime in, as having driven a Volt for a few years when I was at Public Works, the battery capacity in the winter is actually really poor. So for a charge, when you're not using your it's fine not to use your air conditioning around the city, but in the winter you need heat. And when you use your heat on an electric vehicle, you actually can't go very many miles. It drains the battery. There's actually an article I just saw recently that came out, I should forward it, about the capacity of some of these batteries in the winter. So I agree with you that it would be great to use more electric vehicles, but you need to be able to get more than 10 or 15 miles out of battery charge.
Well, that's why if we had charging stations at every city building, when you go across the city to a meeting, you just plug your car in when they're in there. So there's be a way to do it.
And we've been pursuing all kinds of grant opportunities to get additional vehicle charging stations in. And we saw the Galleria charging stations in one of the slides, and we have a number of them. Obviously, there's one right up here at City Hall. There's one at the Public Works Department. They're spread out. We work collaboratively with private garage owners. So, for example, there's Kendall Square, there's the Forest Square Shopping Center. I think 18 in total. The next generation of charging stations will be much more effective, however. The charging stations where you can charge rapidly in 20 minutes. And we're trying to pursue opportunities for getting to one or more of those stations into Cambridge. One of the challenges we have is the number of garage orphans, the number of people who own cars but don't have a driveway at their home. And it's not super easy to figure out how we might contribute to creating charging facilities so that more people could own electric vehicles, whether they have their own driveway or garage or not. But that's something we're pursuing actively in terms of getting grants to try to do these things, and also working with Eversource. And they have recently commissioned a study on electric vehicle charging and garage orphans. So I expect over the course of fiscal 16 that we will have more of a strategy around how we might achieve both fast charging facilities in Cambridge and also a broader distribution of charging opportunities, because the electric vehicles will be coming, and including eventually in the more heavy-duty vehicles as well.
Thank you. In terms of Central Square, the mayor put in an order a while back about improving the signage on the no left turns around at Prospect and Mass Ave. I remember it was you because you beat me to it, and because I wanted to put it in too. And that is, I almost feel like if we put a police officer there all day long, we wouldn't be able to fund the city with the people that take the illegal left turns. I mean, it's amazing. I'm out there all the time. So can we, I don't know if that got lost in the shuffle, but I think and obviously signage is one thing. People are gonna break the law whether there's signage there or not, but I do think we could improve the notification to people and make it more clear to people. So I hope we can get some new signage up there. Even some of the signs that are up there now, the paint's kind of coming off. I mean, I just think we need to improve that to try and help that intersection, because that's a terrible intersection made worse by people taking those illegal turns. Two last things. Are we going to get a report or something around about the Amsterdam trip and sort of what was learned there and what we might see in Cambridge to kind of see what beneficial that trip was?
Yeah, I think we're planning on, I don't know if it's going to be an extensive report given.
I mean, I want to have to sit through all the all the photos.
Well, we won't torture you with that. But no, I think we do need to pull together at least, whether it's some sort of PowerPoint or some sort of product for that, both for other people who are interested in it, but also because of the foundation that paid the majority of the cost is also asking for that. So yeah, we are working on that with the group that went actually met last week to sort of talk that over and work on getting our pieces together. I will say, I think there was a lot of value to it, and I think there's a lot to learn about what we should look at doing, but there's also a lot to say, well, that's a great experience, but we need to sort of turn that around a little bit in terms of how we apply it here, so it's not like one.
And we hear a lot. I mean, I think it's important because there are things that happen in other places that we can do here, or we can modify to do here, and there are things that maybe we can't do here. And we constantly hear from folks, well, look at what Amsterdam's doing, look at what this place is doing, look what that place is doing, and that doesn't necessarily mean it translates to Cambridge. And I think it's important in terms of providing information to the public about what we can and can't do.
Chair. We were just talking about this, and we will certainly do some kind of run back about it, because there are definitely pros and cons to the Dutch model. And it's very, very positive in terms of the bike infrastructure, but there are really important kind of national policy trends, but also behavioral trends, and just how people, what level of comfort or discomfort or risk people are willing to deal with. And so there are very different national models, but there's also the issue of all modes, and our observation was that pedestrians often suffered in the attempt to create great bicycle infrastructure. So as we take that lesson, we have to think about it very holistically in terms of how we translate it to Cambridge, and make sure that they're taking only the positives from that. There are definitely some very good elements, like being able to think about not just one mode. There's this concept of the plus net. Maybe you were just talking about it, so maybe you can talk about it.
And again, I think that's just sort of an advance from the complete streets model, where perhaps on certain streets there's, while you're catering for all modes, there may be sort of, you're prioritizing a couple of those modes on certain streets, so that you're creating sort of a whole infrastructure that works in total, recognizing all of the various modes. And I think there were, as Iram said, like from a broader community perspective, I think we're lucky in Cambridge in that we invest a lot of money in infrastructure. We invest a lot of money in the streets and sidewalks and roadway infrastructure. And we think a lot in terms of the various modes and how best to treat them. I think what's very different in the Netherlands is that there's a national model. It goes beyond the immediate community. And so there are significant benefits that will accrue if one begins to think about this in a larger scale as well. So.
And I think, you mentioned it, I think we also have to look at, it's not just the infrastructure differences, but it's also society and when I was on the school committee, there was a lot of talk of, look at the schools in America compared to Norway, and, Norway is project-based learning and, no testing and all these great things that we really like, and they perform really well. Why can't we do that in the United States? But the United States is very different. Norway pays their teachers like doctors, which we should do, but we don't. The training is different. There's free early childhood education. It's a whole different society that does things differently than we do. So it's not quite as simple as, oh, they're doing that there, let's do it here. Beyond the infrastructure problems, it's how would we respond to those kinds of things as in our culture? So it's important to look at. Lastly, so what do I say to somebody when I say, or how do I respond when I say to someone there are fewer cars on the road, fewer cars in Cambridge, fewer car trips, bike ridership is up, car registration is down, all these things, and yet traffic feels like it's the worst that it's ever been. And so, is it because some of the, is it the commuter traffic? Is it in part because as we have widened sidewalks and added bicycle lanes, we've congested some of the traffic and created more traffic? Whenever I tell people that car ridership is down, people look at me like I'm out of my mind, because all they know is it's taking me an extra half an hour to get home than it did 5 years ago. What do I tell them?
I guess I'll start and others can add if they choose. I think that a lot of it is, and I think I mentioned this last week when I was in response to the council order on President current parking, that we do see, as a community that's sort of close to but not right in the center, we do see a lot of traffic from other communities that have neither an origin nor a destination in Cambridge that are traveling through Cambridge, and that's not consistently the case, but there are we can, I think, to encourage these other modes and try to have a more sustainable transportation system. But I think there are other parts of the region that maybe haven't quite caught up as much. Although I think everyone's kind of pulling in the same direction these days. So I think it's partly a regional issue, in terms of spreading that gospel or whatever you want to call it around more broadly. And I do think if you say as compared to 5 years ago, I mean I do think even when you look at some of the trend lines, there was a dip even as compared to today in certain locations of traffic, during the depths of the recession. And so I wouldn't say that every year it's going down year over year, but the overall trend is downward. And so any sort of like a stock perspective, your individual experience may vary, but it is one person may have a bad experience, but I think in general we're seeing that the traffic volumes are going down in this use of other modes, and so it sort of it's a more of a kind of long haul approach to say, well, it's going to take some time to get there. And I think that's actually very consistent with what we learned when we were in the Netherlands, which is that the system that you see there today didn't happen overnight. If you look back 40 years ago, they were sort of headed down the same path that we've been on in terms of a more car-centric society, and they really did a lot of different things to change that, and it's taken them that whole time to get to where they are today. So again, some of these things take a little while to pan out. I think we are starting to see some of the results of the work that we were doing 20 years ago, and like in the redesign of Central Square, for example. But it's still going to take many more years to see it all, get to where we'd like it to be.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to just thank city staff for a great presentation. I'm going to actually piggyback on something that Councilman Govern talked about, and that is the idea of complete streets, that model. I know that when we had the opportunity to go to Amsterdam, we talked about complete streets not being the best model for us here in Cambridge. And I just wonder if we could just talk a little bit about that, especially the idea of accommodating all modes of transportation on one artery, as opposed to 1 or 2 modes of transportation, but also prioritizing pedestrians. I think sometimes we tend to forget that a lot of people do walk in Cambridge, and oftentimes there is conflict between people that are on their bikes and people that are walking, especially as it relates to senior citizens and people on wheelchairs. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and what you see as the model that we would be moving into over the next couple of years.
I didn't have the benefit of accompanying everyone to Amsterdam, and I know a lot more about Copenhagen than I do about Amsterdam, but my understanding is that the hierarchy that they use in Holland, where there are streets where they don't prioritize bicyclists and pedestrians, are really major roads, not a street that is comparable to a Cambridge street. So I think they do use a complete streets approach to city streets, just like we're proposing to do. And so, like if you take a street like Memorial Drive, we also don't have bicyclists on the road. There's a side path for bicyclists on that type of a street. But a street like our arterials inside the city, like Mass Ave or Hampshire Street or Western Ave or whichever one you want to use an example, the Dutch would also see those as complete streets. It, of course, varies depending on what the street type is, what level of treatment you would use. I mean, on a quiet residential street, you wouldn't try to build like a separated bike facility or use striped bike lanes. We don't do that. But so there is a complete street approach will very much differ depending on how that street is used.
Thank you. I mean, I know that we're going to prepare some kind of a report, and I just wonder if I could hear from those that were with me on the trip. So, taking this trip and looking at what we're doing in Cambridge and looking at what they're doing in Amsterdam in terms of like complete streets, that model, what would you change here in Cambridge as we move forward? And I know that we still haven't completed our report, but I'm just curious to see what.
Well, I guess I was just sort of following up on what Suzanne was saying. I think that, it's as we talked about when we were there, it's challenging, given that ambition exceeds our right-of-way. And so, we're trying to do more with our streets than we really have room for. And so, I think sometimes we do need to look at how we prioritize that. And so I think, as I think Goen and Aram were mentioning, I think, in the Netherlands, they've the prioritization of pedestrians, which I think we would probably say is primary, and I don't think any of us certainly ever forget how many people walk in Cambridge, is something that doesn't get as much attention. So I think we should celebrate the fact that we've made that really an important part of what we do. But then beyond that, I think there are trade-offs to be made, but I think as Kara mentioned in the context of Central Square and Mass Ave, a lot of times the places that people want to get to are also the places where those conflicts and those, the priorities are hardest to make. And so I think, it just calls on us to be very, as smart as we can be, involve the community as much as we can be in the community, very broadly defined, in making those decisions so that the answers that we come out with at the end, are the right answers for that location, for that community. They're not going to be the same answers in every location. I know we talked a little about the concept, of a complete city, not just a complete street, and there may be cases where we have to say, well, we can't do everything for every mode on every street. And I do think those priorities need to be established, but they also need to be established within the context of the local need and what people are trying to accomplish on that corridor. So, I think there's one thing I would take away from our experience there is that there's no right answer for every single situation. And I think, we do a lot of community outreach already. We need to do more of it, but I think if we do that right, then hopefully we'll come to the right answer at the end of the day.
Thank you, and I appreciate it, because I think it's important as we make these major infrastructure investments that we reconsider the complete streets model, so we're not, continuing down a path where, saying this is the model that we're using, but then 5 years from now we figured out that, that wasn't the best model, and we probably should have implemented, some other ideas. And one concept that we did talk about was the complete cities, and I think what made us think a little bit about that concept was, how the transportation network operates in places like Amsterdam, where, if you want to get to work, you take the train, or you ride your bike to the train station, you park your bike in a bike facility, you jump on the train, you walk to work, or you jump on another bike. Here, part of the problem is that we don't have sufficient parking garages for cars, which, hurts business, particularly in places like Kendall Square. I know that I've talked to many of the business owners in Kendall Square, and, finding parking is very difficult. So if you don't take the MBTA, if you don't ride your bike, if you don't walk to Kendall Square, it's very, very difficult for you to find a place so that you can, go in and, enjoy a bite to eat. So I think, one of the things that I didn't hear a lot about was what are we thinking in terms of parking garages, and what are we thinking in terms of bike facilities in the future, and will we actually have those?
I'm going to give this to Joe because parking is really in his purview, but I did want to say one thing before we go is that I think in some ways we are a little bit in that awkward stage that Netherlands had to go through while they were transitioning from a time when they had a very they were starting to move towards a car-centric world, and when they put on the brakes and said we have to prioritize bicycles as a sustainable mode, as a mode that makes people healthier and happier. And in some ways we are at that point, so we have to start thinking about not just parking for cars, but parking for bikes. And I think we are lucky that we have created a really pedestrian-friendly environment, because no matter what other mode of transportation we use, everybody is a pedestrian at some point or the other. And I think one other piece that stayed with me was when we visited this business district and spoke to the BIT manager, who essentially talked about taking away parking and how concerned the businesses were about the parking going away. And after a couple of years being in that situation, they really don't want the parking back, because they realized that they are getting, from an economic development perspective, far greater clientele from the people who are bicycling blocking of the streets where they are actually able to see and shop and stop. So with that, I haven't addressed the parking pieces of it.
It's not an easy answer, I guess, is how I would start. I think, as I alluded to last week, the parking supply we provide is, is a delicate balance between supporting, the residents' needs, customers' needs, that, and all the different needs of why people park, but also, not providing so much parking, not that that's really a danger these days, but so much parking that we're engendering additional driving and sort of not, having getting to the transportation system that we need. So I think that, finding that balance is a struggle we go through on a daily basis. I do think that we, as we think more creatively about how we use the street right of way, like I said, we often have greater ambition for it than we have space, that, the role that, there is an important question in terms of what the role of off-street parking is in all of that. So I think in general, we would say, well, we're not big fans of creating more off-street parking lots or more off-street parking garages, but if doing so gives us greater flexibility to do more with our streets, whether it's for transportation reasons or stormwater management reasons or just general, community reasons, then I think that's a trade-off we should be willing to look at. So like I said, I wouldn't necessarily support, massive additions of off-street parking all over the city, but if it's sort of, that's part of what it takes, maybe even just as a transition strategy to get sort of through that awkward phase that Ron referenced, that may be the way, what we need to look at in order to be able to accomplish our larger goals. And then maybe eventually when that parking is no longer needed as we transition, to the sort of, carbon neutral type of world that Suzanne was mentioning, that can become, housing or park or some other use. And so we're not saying that forever and ever this has to be a parking lot or a parking garage. So I think that's a very interesting discussion to have. I can't certainly say that I know what the answer is right sitting here today.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's exactly right, man. I think, for example, in Central Square on Pearl Street, if we were to reconsider redeveloping that parking garage, then I think that would give us more flexibility of what we can possibly do in the future on Pearl Street, and will certainly help us, achieve that balance where there are people that still use their cars and they continue to use their cars, but now we're at least providing an alternative to parking on the street. I wanted to just zoom in a little bit on Center Square and sidewalk reconstruction plans for Center Square. Just wanted to know where we are with that.
Sure. So we are in the process of pulling together part of the bid package for Pearl Street. So as part of that, we're going to put in the next sort of 2 blocks of looking at Mass Ave and Central Square. And this is really looking at a maintenance scale project. So it's similar to the work that was done a couple years ago. We're really just sort of rehabilitating the existing sidewalks. And so we're in the process of finalizing those. I should also tell people that we're going to include, as part of last year's participatory budget process, I know this is not transportation, but as part of last year's participatory budget process, there was a public toilet that was funded for Central Square, so we're also going to be putting that in that same package. And then after the holidays, we'll be working with the community to finalize the location of that. But there was, the public toilet was funded in Central Square. And what we've been doing is trying to wait for the Harvard Square one to be operational before we finalize the location and the design for the Central Square location.
So with respect to the sidewalk reconstruction of Center Square, those plans, I know that there's some challenges with redoing sidewalks in Center Square because of some foundation issues with some of the buildings. And I guess, my question is, it appears that those reconstruction plans are incredibly slow, right? So if we're looking at just 2 blocks, I know we completed a section of sidewalk in front of Dunkin' Donuts, but right now there's asphalt there. And I guess part of the problem that I have with any project that's ongoing in Central Square is that, at what point are we going to say Central Square looks great, right? Are we looking at 5 years? Are we looking at 10 years? How much participation and cooperation do we need from the property owners in Central Square? What are the costs associated with doing that foundation work, and is that something that's slowing us down? Because I've said a lot about Central Square, and I don't want to wait another 5 years before we see new sidewalks in Central Square, we see new trees, and we see, trash barrels replaced. And so, I'd like to really see us, approach this with some intensity, and if it's going to cost us some additional money, I think, it'd be good to know what it's going to cost us if we have to get involved in some of this foundation work that needs to be done on some of these private properties. So I don't know if you can comment just briefly on that.
Sure, I would say that, the areaways, the foundation work with the buildings is a fairly significant commitment on behalf of the property owners. So we've had 2 that have been completed, and that is the area that you're talking about down in front of Dunkin' Donuts, so we'll be redoing that sidewalk as part of this next package. We're currently working actively with 2 other property owners. It's a significant process for them to get a designer on board, to get plans, to secure funding, and to get a contractor on board. So it is a significant commitment on their behalf. We do have a number of other property owners in Central Square. We'll be working over the winter to try to pick them off as well in terms of making sure that those areaways are both secure in the short term and that they're also looking at long-term reconstruction projects.
Just a couple more questions. I want to just focus a little bit on the port infrastructure improvements. I know that we had talked about piloting some bike infrastructure improvements, and even I had talked a little bit about tinted asphalt. And I just wondered if, as plans to continue to proceed, what we could possibly see in our neighborhood that could help encourage more people to get on their bikes and encourage us to have more neighborhood streets as opposed to arteries where people just drive really fast on the street.
So I think, there's a couple things. One is that we'll have a really extensive community process, and I think one of the things we're trying to do now is really think about how best to design that process, because I'm not sure the sort of formal meeting process is the right approach. And so we're really in the process of brainstorming to figure out what are the best ways to really reach out to people and make sure that we get sort of full participation from the community. So, in terms of what the streets look like when we're completed, it'll really be part of that community process. So, I showed the photos of Longfellow Road that has the shared residential street. I think there's a lot of opportunities for something like that in the port, but again, that's really part of the community process in terms of, what are the trade-offs? Does that take parking? Does that add parking? Does it make it easier for people to bike and walk? So those will all be part of that discussion. And similarly with materials as well. So that would be part of that process.
And I know, Manager Rossi, I don't know if there's any updates on the bill, the transportation network bill at the State House. I'm just curious because I think as part of thinking about this transportation network system, we've got to rethink, taxi stands, we've got to rethink, Uber and ride sharing, and things seem to be moving very slow at the State House. I'm just wondering where everything's at with that.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So last week I attended a meeting with representatives from the city of Boston, the city of Somerville, myself, and the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. They are trying to put together, hopefully, what they consider to be a united front amongst the cities and towns of the MAPC to pass on to the legislature, urging them obviously to pass the bill to give it some clarity. So again, we talked about the common themes, which are, equalizing the insurance so that the insurance that TNCs would carry and provide would be equal to what we require cab drivers to have to do. They talked about background checks and, talked to each community about what they require now versus what, the bill might say. Again, trying to develop some parallel themes by the local communities. And they talked about the insurance, background checks, the inspections of the vehicles, putting all that together. I think the legislation now only calls for one inspection, where I think Cambridge and Somerville will require two. So we'd be urging them to make sure that the TNCs have to do exactly what we require the counties to do. Our theory being that if you're being picked up in Cambridge as a consumer, you assume that this is something that the city of Cambridge is aware of, supports, etc. And that's what we're trying to emphasize to the legislature. And at the same time, the license can be, the commission has been having meetings with members of the cab industry as requested by the council order to talk about ideas, Lyft, and Uber have also participated.
Just one more quick question. With regard to the Green Line extension, do we have the figures of what kind of contribution they'd be looking for the city to make?
So these deficits are in billions, right? This is number, and we've continued to try and ask, so what is it? I don't think that clarity exists yet. This is going to be a long process. It would not surprise me if this is delayed for quite some time. And, in the meantime, we will continue to work with them. We're going to be at a meeting on Wednesday where Secretary Pollock is going to talk to Cambridge and Somerville and many of the other metropolitan mayors and managers about, what's going on with the Green Line. And there's an emergency meeting, not an emergency meeting, a scheduled meeting tomorrow that just came out, where we will send a representative, and I think we're going to hear more about, exactly what this means. But I think it's pretty much what you're going to hear or read tomorrow in the paper or hear on the news that, they're going to, this project will be delayed until, I think they're going to rehire consultants and, start from way back at scratch. So this is going to be a long process. I think it's unfortunate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to the group, I'm pleased by the update. I think a number of these items are data that we've seen before, and so I'm just happy to see it all in one place with some context and some exhaustive treatment. Something I've kind of talked about on the side for a long time, and would be happy to see us formalize, is some kind of group lobbying effort. I think there's probably two things that are important here. One is that obviously the city administrative already interfaces with MBTA and Massachusetts legislature, but that we as councilors hold probably a great deal of political import in the process, but we never combine forces and lobby on Beacon Hill or on Capitol Hill when we're there for National League of Cities. And there's a couple of opportunities a year for us to really make our voice known as one, and that it probably will make a difference, especially on the federal level, given that we're already in DC a couple times a year. The other is that, as I think Stephen Kaiser and others have said, is that there really needs to be kind of serious engineering problem solving, and that the MBTA, paired with good management, the MBTA and the state don't always actually engage that in a way that makes sense to or involves policymakers and residents. And so for those of us in the city administration who are engineers, and for those of us on the policymaking side who are engineers, I'd like to see a little bit more discussion on the engineering and process precepts of this, because it's kind of all about billions of dollars and things that, like, there are solutions we've talked about in this chamber that would improve the capacity of a red line car at rush hour in Kendall Square. There's solutions that engineers in the audience have posited for the process as it goes forward, and I'm not sure that each of those things is dealt with by the MBTA in an exhaustive way, and sometimes even at all. I wouldn't even know where to begin telling the MBTA what to do from a process perspective to make stations safer and more effective without costing any money, except maybe in messaging or enforcement. So I think for me, those two things, the lobbying and the kind of process and engineering conversation, are the low-hanging fruit, and I would very much like to be involved. I wonder who would be the shepherd for those two conversations.
First of all, I think if what you're saying is that the city council would work on some policies, suggestions, ideas for the T, etc., and forward those through the council process and through the administration, we would, certainly be willing to do that. I think that's what I would understand the city of Cambridge policy coming from the elected officials, and, we would certainly be willing to work with a committee to, make some recommendations in that regard. If that's what you're talking about, I think that works. I think it works as a system. How they're going to react to that, I can't guarantee. But I think we would, certainly be willing to do that, put together a letter, maybe even ask other communities if they're interested to join us. We can even work with the MAPC to do that if Cambridge has a particular sort of policy, set of policy issues they want to forward. That works. I think it's more difficult if it's a city council saying, this is what I want, that's the voice of the city council, that's more difficult, so.
Through you, Mr. Chair, it's definitely the former, not the latter. I'm not saying, I mean, to the extent that I have ideas, I would put them in the mix with others. I don't have a really strong agenda personally. I'm just saying that it seems like there's a conversation to be had. It seems like there's expertise in every room having to do with transit that we convene, and it just, to me, and I dealt with the MBTA prior to becoming a councilor, it seems like there's a really eminent disconnect between the people who make decisions there and the expertise that exists in the room anyway, frankly. I guess my point is that part of that is a discussion, meeting question, and inviting the right people there and following up with them. And part of it is a lobbying question. The part that you addressed is great. The other part I would love to see addressed in the medium term is how do 9 of us and maybe a state rep or a state senator get into a room with a state legislator and then ultimately get to an MBTA administrator, make some asks and follow up.
So I think, you could, again, work with us to, I think there's expertise in the city that would help lend itself towards these policy decisions. You would write a letter that we would send off to the T, possibly asking for a meeting. And if you wanted to be the city council side, suggest that, the mayor write the letter, ask for the meeting. We're certainly willing to join with you in that. And we could actually see if they're willing to come over here and talk to us. I think if we're going to do that, we should have our ducks in a row before we invite them over, to have a more fruitful conversation. I think for a while this thing is going to get worse before it gets better. And I think the information is not going to be great. So, I want to just see a little bit how it plays out.
That sounds great. I assume that we would begin convening ourselves a little bit, maybe on the policy side for in Q1, and then maybe end of Q1 we can invite them to something next year. Okay, my last point is through you, Mr. Chair, to Vice Mayor Benson. I appreciate the questions because the answers were illuminating on complete streets and on their place in the city. But I just want to also put out the kind of complementary perspective that I think the complete streets attitude can, and in fact does, treat fairly all modes of transportation and a safe perspective on all modes of transportation. But I think that one of the things we can do is a gradual approach, in particular to parking. And I think that Pearl Street is a great example where over time the need for parking, the conversation Councilor Kelly and others are trying to have on driverless cars, automation, sharing economy, all kinds of other things. These are important conversations. Obviously, Councilor Chung next to me, a leader in this conversation as well. I guess my point is that there are going to be some things that change, and the need in particular for parking and for other things is going to diminish over time. But to make very bold moves, it can be really scary to people, and it of course can read as not treating all modes of transportation fairly. So I just wanted to say that I don't think that particular example or the conversations we have with respect to parking in general have to obviate a strong advocacy for complete streets. In fact, the opposite. I think that complete streets will move very cleanly and swiftly into our set of priorities and will naturally be lauded and appreciated by neighborhoods. And in fact, that's already beginning to be the case. Even in the case of Pearl Street, you saw 50% of residents wanting complete streets immediately with no love lost for parking, and the other side, people wanting to protect parking. That's probably a good place for me to stop. Thank you.
I did that. Denise.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
What's your name?
The hour being late, I will really be brief. It was a very good conversation. There was a lot that came out. It makes you want to ask a lot of questions. Hopefully we'll have another time to do this. Through you, Mr. Chair, to Ms. Rasmussen, we'll have to go to the next follow-up trip just to make sure that, we're following up the recommendations appropriately. So, very briefly, we didn't talk about this, but I'm just curious. When we talk about traffic improvements, one of the problems I see that we have as a parent of former parent of young children, is what happens at our schools around pickup and drop off. And as we're thinking through how do we improve traffic movement, and I think about Grant Street, that's a major thoroughfare for those people that are going over the bridge. And can we do something about the bridge? Because the traffic there is just a nightmare from 3 o'clock on. I don't know what the answer to that is. But do we think about how we can improve the traffic? Now, we're going to do work, and thank you for this, in the port around continue the works. I know it started, and thank you, the sidewalks being very swollen, and thank you, did I say thank you for, fixing that drainage problem on Pine Street. But when we think about the Fletcher Manor at between 7:30 and 8:15, the traffic backs up all the way almost to Columbia because parents have no place to park, so they got to double park, and then no one can get down the street. So as you're looking at how do we improve the traffic, do we look at that around the schools where we get these jams almost every morning and every afternoon?
Two things about that. The first one is we do have some problems that almost look as you just described. One of the more unsolvable ones, unless you really did things like eliminated neighborhood parking on one side, which I think would make people crazy. But
absolutely.
So in the Putnam Ave School, we were able to really do a much different plan. We were able to talk to residents and the schools and the teachers and the police and have a safer plan. We did that at the Peabody School, the old Fitzgerald up on Ridge Ave. We created a much better situation. We are doing that currently as we plan for the King Open at the old Harrington on Cambridge Street. So as we do the new schools, it's easier. As we deal with a Cambridge Port School on Elm Street, we do not have many alternatives at all. Same with Fletcher Manor. Those are really a lot different. Longfellow is really a tough one to deal with.
It is quite the nightmare.
It is. They all are.
The reason why I bring up Fletcher Manor is because we're in the process of doing street traffic improvements. Maybe when we go back to the neighborhood to follow our earlier discussion we had in the fall, start to talk to the neighbors and say, what would you see as some of the improvements? I mean, there was a time that at Fletcher Manor, you couldn't park after 8 o'clock. There was some hourly restriction, and it made traffic move a little bit better because we gave up on that. And so now we're back to traffic jams. But I think let's bring it back to the community and have a conversation, because if you're driving, and I know we want to get people out of their cars, but if you're driving, it's really a nightmare. So I just wanted to bring that up. The other thing I wanted to bring up is something I noticed in Boston just recently, and this is so to you, Mr. Barr. And at least in downtown Boston, there is designated parking for mopeds and motorcycles. We don't do that in Cambridge. Is there a particular reason why we don't? And the reason why I ask, there's nothing worse than having an SUV parked on the corner, because you can't see around it. And if it were motorcycle Vespa parking, I think the line of sight would be better. So is it something that we've thought about or we didn't think about? Because what?
As you say, currently we don't. I don't know if we've ever looked at that in detail, although I know a number of cities have provided that or looked at providing that. So it's certainly something we can look at. Although I guess the one thing I will mention about mopeds and motorcycles is that although they seem like they are maybe good environmentally and they use less gasoline, but because they're not subject to emissions controls, they're very nasty devices in terms of
and I'm not saying
I'm
not trying to promote them, but we have them.
Yeah, we have them.
And people park them on the sidewalk.
Yeah, and to go back to our experience in the Netherlands, not to mention that again, but
don't.
A problem that I think we all agree was sort of rampant there was the number of scooters, and they were parked all over the sidewalks and bike racks and everywhere, and really detracted, I think, from the urban environment. So I think we'd be we'd be smart to try to get ahead of the problem rather than.
I would really recommend it. Again, the biggest problem, one, it might help with line of sight on corners. But the second thing is what I have found in certain neighborhoods more so than others, where they are used or people use them, they tend to put them on the sidewalk. And so they're obstructing. If you're in a device that helps you, you know, if you're physically challenged and you're using one of those motorized vehicles, now you're negotiating a Vespa or a scooter that may or may not have fallen in the street, into the sidewalk. And so I just put that out to you. And then, but my very last thing has to do with Central Square, to follow up on what the Vice Mayor had discussed. You said you're going to do a number of street improvements. It's so funny you had mentioned that. When I walked through Central Square today, particularly in CVS, the streets all uneven, it's brick. So the streets are all uneven, then you get to this black asphalt, and you kind of say, gee, what's going on here? But if we're going to make those improvements and we're going to have a process, you have C2, you have the cultural district. So how do we garner all the information from all these two processes plus what you're already doing to make sure that Central Square does become, and would you say, Mr. Vice Mayor, tell me when we get there, but when we get there, we all get there. So it's C2, it's this cultural district, and it's what you're doing with the streets. But right now, it seems like we have 3 things, maybe 4, happening in Central Square, and it looks like a patchwork quilt, as opposed to some sort of organized, well thought out process. And we spent so much time on C2, and we get this designation as a cultural district, and I just don't see anything that is consistent and organized happening. And I just don't want to see this opportunity wasted, so that at the end of it, we come back with something that's not well pulled together. And then the last thing I would say to Central Square, there was a conversation some time ago about the idea of having in Central Square sort of a, I can't think of it, like a Faneuil Hall kind, where you didn't drive through it on Sundays, where Sundays it was off limits. I've spoken about this, the Vice Mayor's spoken about, having sort of a push cart economy where it became an active spot. You talked about people being on foot or on bikes where they stop and they participate and they go into the restaurants and the stores. But they can't do that when you're just being shuttled through, if you will, the square. So, I guess closing remarks as we end this very good discussion is that we look at Central Square as a priority area and keeping all those sort of pieces in play. Do we ever want to make Central Square a place where people just kind of come and congregate, participate in what goes on? How do we make it, how do we all tie it together in a neat bow as opposed to having all these different ideas coming together? Thank you.
What Councilor Simmons failed to mention is she's getting a Harley for Christmas.
A double-seater.
I'm not going to ask any questions in the interest of time. I am going to just make a couple of very quick comments. I think first of all, we can't shy away from the fact that as a community, we have this very strange relationship with the state. You look at from the Science Museum all the way to the Arlington line, we're bordered by a state road, and then on the Somerville side, we are also bordered by a state road. I think that many of the traffic issues, or the bigger traffic issues that we face, are state-related in this conversation. So I think as a community, we need to figure out how we can have these conversations. And I know that, Mr. Manager, you and I have had some of these conversations, but how can we help? And it gets a little bit to what Councilor Mazin was saying, is how do we use the advocacy role that we have to move some of this stuff forward? I will completely say I am totally perplexed as to how the state was so off with the numbers on the Greenway. And I think for one administration to be touting this was all attainable, it was going to happen, and send out the timeline, and for the next administration to say they were off by billions of dollars. It seems to me the taxpayers in the Commonwealth should be raising hell over this issue and saying, how did this ever happen? I look at the crossings along Freshpond Parkway. I will say that they put up the guardrail on Freshpond Parkway between Brown and Mount Auburn Street. That was requested. But, looking at how those crossings can be made safer for people going forward, again, this is a conversation between the city and the state. Some of the, I think we, again, cannot shy away from the fact that the situation with the Alewife problem, all of that traffic that's coming in from the western suburbs, that is not our issue in its entirety. We are facing the wrath of folks about that, but that's a state issue, and how we can address that, whether there is a commuter space there, whether there's an expansion of parking facilities for people coming from the western suburbs. You don't want to come in from Lexington, Parker, Littleton, and get to the RYT stop, and then find no parking. So that's, again, an issue that we have to be advocating for there. I just want to say, no one's mentioned it, is I find what is going on in Inman Square is complete and utter chaos. And I will say, just coming off of an election season, that anyone who stood in Inman Square, you stand there as a candidate, and I am like awed at how many accidents I just miss seeing. Some of it is an enforcement issue. I will say, going past the Cambridge Hospital into Inman Square, countless people taking the left and going up Beacon Street that shouldn't be doing it, and people cutting in front of bikes going around. It is to me amazing that there is not more issues right there. And I will say, I want to just echo the discussion about the tour buses and us working with Harvard University to find places where those tour buses can go. I think that the redesign seems to be working along Mount Street. It seems to be working a little bit better right now, but I don't think we're in a little bit of an off season, so we haven't quite seen how that's going to work yet. I will say at the intersection of Elliott and Mount Auburn Street, I always wish I had a book of tickets and I had the authority to write tickets. It's constant that the violators going through that intersection. I think we're trying to look at safety issues throughout the city. I applaud the efforts that are happening. And I think that obviously, the last comment I'm going to make is, I think when you live in a community, you think that we have all the issues. And what I would say to folks is, at 5 o'clock at night or 5:30 at night, go to Pleasant Street in Arlington, or go to Pleasant Street in Lexington, or go to Watertown Square, or Arsenal Street in Watertown, or Lake Street in Arlington, and the traffic there is worse than it is here. And so if it's at all comforting, this is an issue that goes well beyond the confines of the city of Cambridge. And I know that it's a regional issue, and it's an issue where, we have great, you can't get from point A to point B without going to Cambridge in many instances. And I think, that's the issue about working with the state. I was very hopeful at the beginning of the new administration at the State House that we were going to start to see a little bit, it seemed like we were going to see a little bit of more attention paid to this. We're a year into it. I don't want to say it's not going to happen, but I think we have to keep the pressure on to make sure that they're listening to what we're saying, because this community, as well as Boston, are the two leading communities that are driving the economic engine of the Commonwealth, and they need to pay a little bit of attention. I think it is quite honestly a shame what's happened with that green line. Somebody cooked the book somewhere along the line to make themselves look good, and it's really not what should have been happening. But I want to just take the opportunity to thank all of you for your attendance here and for the good work that you're doing, and the good work that you will be doing in the future to make things a little bit safer and more efficient in Cambridge. And with